They say that what the day when a Palestinian leader will do a cut and paste on Willy Brandt's speech from 1970 after he made an agreement with Poland over the border, will know that the Palestinian people have finally come to terms with the fact that the War of 1948 is over, that the lands that they consider theirs are no longer theirs, and that they can move on to establish a state next to Israel, but not instead of Israel. We're not there yet.
So, Eynat, the full title of your book is The War Return and How the Western Indulgence to the Palestinian Dreams has obfuscated the path to peace. And I believe that when you write about the Western indulgence, you mean both Europe and the US. But for the last 2 years, at least, the last 3 years by now, there have been so many changes in the US. And can you elaborate a little bit more on the changes you've seen in the situation, thanks to the Trump administration very strong stance on this question?
Certainly. So a bit of background so we understand how long we've come. During the 20th century, of course, there's a lot of new states, new borders, partitions, tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of refugees. The only reason that the Palestinians, unlike the Germans, Poles, Ukrainians, Hindus, Muslims, South Koreans, North Koreans, the reason that the Palestinians are indulged by the West to keep being refugees rather than moving on is that at that moment, because of the Cold War, because of Arab oil, the West doesn't want to anger the Arab world. And when the Arab world pretty much tells, at the time it's the US and the UK, it tells them, look, you made one mistake when you supported partition, you don't want to make another, UNRWA will remain open. So till today, UNRWA is a still temporary organization, and the Palestinian refugees are not going to be settled, which means the War of 1948 will remain open. And the West is willing to indulge that, thinking that, you know, it's a small price to pay. But it's really what it becomes like a mafia racket. It becomes a protection scheme. The West basically plays the Arab world so that the Arab world will not be angry at the West. Jump to the present. The Arab League is not the same unified force it was in the 50s. Oil is not what it was. There's no Cold War, so there's no concern that the Arab world will go to the Soviet bloc. So all the conditions that forced the Western world to indulge the Arab demand and the Palestinian desire to keep the War of 1948 open have disappeared. And I think what the Trump administration instinctively realized, I don't know, maybe they understand rackets and protection, they understood that the conditions have changed, and that at this moment there will be zero consequences for pulling out. And they were right. They pulled out, and there were zero consequences. The only missed opportunity that we explain in the book is that it's a shame that the US didn't do more to explain to Europe that it should do the same. Instead, it became just a thing about Europe should pay more money, and indeed, especially Germany gave more money, and that was it. That ended the story, which is a shame, because what we would have wanted to see is this domino effect of more and more countries saying, we're getting out of this racket also. I mean, why are we paying $1 billion a year for an agency that makes sure that there will never be peace? I mean, this is the thing. On the one side, European countries claim that they support peace by means of 2 states for 2 peoples. And on the other hand, they give $1 billion a year to the organization that will ensure that this will never happen. It literally makes no sense. So for us, this is still a missed opportunity, which we hope to correct with the help of people like you, to get Europeans to understand that they need to pull out of UNRWA too, because they need to help the Palestinians go through the process that the German refugees did, that to understand that the war is over. In the book, we have a very simple phrase. We said, if you want peace, the war must end, right? This is really basic. Well, the Palestinians still think that the war is not over, and no one has bothered to tell them that the war is over. So until they are clearly told by their European $1 billion a year funders that the war of 1948 is over, that they are not refugees, that they do not possess a right of return. In the book, we explain why it's not an internationally sanctioned right. Only then can they begin the process of changing their identity and their foundational ethos.
Okay, I have one last question, and then I will open the floor for the Q&A. What do you think will be the consequences of the Brexit? How do you see the situation of the English leaving the European Union, and what could be the impact on the UNRWA? Do you see any?
Unfortunately, still, sadly, one of our biggest problems in getting European nations and the EU to back out of UNRWA is sadly the Israeli security establishment. There was recently a documentary in Israel about the war in Lebanon, the security area that we spent 18 bloody years. And the 4 mothers who got us out of it, and Ehud Barak, of course. But the amazing thing is that they interview all these high military officers who say, we were just stuck mentally. Every time we said to ourselves, we cannot afford to get out. The present situation is better than the alternative. Until one day we got out, and that was it. And all of them say we should have done it much earlier. It's the same with UNRWA. The Israeli military establishment is stuck in this worldview that UNRWA is somehow a moderating force in the region, In the book, we show that if anything, it's a radicalizing force in the region that radicalizes Palestinians generation after generation to keep fighting for everything. So the problem is that after, it's only someone like President Trump who basically told Israelis, I don't care, I'm getting my money out. But as soon as he did it, I'm sorry to say, Israeli officials went to Europe and said, please keep giving money. So what we hope is that there will be more leaders in Europe who will basically say to the Israeli security establishment, we're not listening to you. It makes no sense for us to keep paying, and we're not going to pay. They don't listen to the Israeli security establishment in other things. Why are they suddenly listening to them in this? So I don't know that Brexit itself is the issue. The UK is a major funder of UNRWA. We've met with members of parliament in the UK who are open and want to change it. But you really need sometimes people like President Trump who are willing to just break with old world views and say, I'm out of here, and nothing happens.
Yeah, maybe one last question. What do you think about the peace agreements that we had with the Emirates that was announced last week? And what could be its impact on the European vision of the Israelo-Palestinian situation?
So that's actually very exciting. I wrote a piece for The Telegraph in which I call this agreement an Arab first. It's not the first peace agreement, but it's the first one that feels like peace. As I'm sure you know, for Arabs, normalization is a much more important thing than peace. Peace means like we don't attack you, fine. But as you know, Jordan and Egypt have spent the last few decades making it clear that they're not friends to Israel. They've had UN initiatives against Israel. They're not friends with us. They don't visit us. There's no cultural or economic cooperation. Egypt is the #1 producer and purveyor of anti-Semitic content to the Arab world. And then comes the UAE and has basically a normalization agreement. And tourism, and ever since just the announcement, we don't even yet have an agreement yet. My Twitter feed is full of Emiratis waving Israeli flags and singing Hatikva and really showing that they want to be our friends. And this matters because at the core of the conflict, and this goes back to the Palestinian issue, is the idea that Israel is foreign, that Israel doesn't belong. Israel is like the French in Algeria. Israel is like the Crusaders. Why is this at the core of the conflict? Because it basically means that ultimately we'll go away. If we're like the French in Algeria, we will leave. So the only way the conflict ends is when the Arab world finally stops viewing us as the French in Algeria or the Crusaders and views us as an indigenous people who have a history in the region and that actually belong here. And this is what the Emiratis are offering. And that's why it's a really big deal. And I think over time it will have an impact on Europe because especially if this gathers force, if you have other countries, I think it will be more difficult, not impossible, but it will be more difficult for Europeans to be holier than the Arab Pope, to be more against normalization, to be more against Israel than the Arabs themselves. And I think that could be the impact over time.